Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, it's simple. Trade deadline recap. All the moves that Billy Epler made to make the Mets better. We'll talk some of the other big moves that went on around baseball that could impact the Mets down the stretch. And as always, we will dive into your mailbag questions. So exciting show today. Reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcast, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Mets Pod, and it's a big one because the trade deadline is over and the Mets made some moves. I'm your host, Connor Rogers. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, Joe DeMayo. Joe, let's get right to it. Let's bring in the Mets right at the wire, acquire some bullpen help in Mychal Givens. They got Darin Ruf to platoon, as you would say, in their DH spot. What is your initial thought? I want to start right there, Joe. We're going to get into every single move the Mets made, what their roster looks like or what it could look like going into the postseason race. But I want to keep things simple and break every move down by the impact it can have individually on this roster. What do you think with the Mets, rather than acquiring a splashy DH, go with the platoon of Vogelbach and Darin Ruf going forward?
Yeah, I'm never going to be able to say platoon. Just feels
there it
weird
is
for me. Yeah, I don't like it. So yeah, I'm rolling platoon, and like it, don't like it, it doesn't matter. You know what I mean. But the reality of the deadline is, obviously, I think some fans, and reasonably so, are a little underwhelmed. I think there was an expectation of sorts that some bigger things were going to happen. Obviously, the Mets were linked to Wilson Contreras, who didn't get traded. They were linked to JD Martinez, who also didn't get traded. But ultimately, this deadline, and we're obviously going to focus on the moves that happened today, but we can't forget that Daniel Vogelbach and Tyler Naquin also count as trade deadline moves. Just because it didn't happen on August 2nd doesn't mean they don't count. And overall, I think from the offensive side of the ball, the Mets improved on the margins, and we talked about Travis Jankowski's performance, and it's like he was essentially a pinch runner. The Mets got an actual fourth outfielder in Tyler Naquin. The designated hitter spot, a black hole with the way Dom Smith and JD Davis were performing. Come on in, Darin Ruf and Daniel Vogelbach. Your DH performance is now better. The one thing that I'm going to be critical of is they did not get a lefty reliever. We've been talking about this since the spring, that the one thing that it felt like this team really missed on in the offseason was kind of thinking they could redo the Aaron Loop move from last year, where they signed Loop for 1 year, $3 million, kind of a small move, and turned him into obviously what Aaron Loop was. I think they thought between Joely Rodriguez and Chasen Shreve, who's no longer here, between one of them, they'd be able to figure this out. And clearly that has not happened, as Shreve is gone and Joely Rodriguez has been at best inconsistent. So it's definitely a bit puzzling to me that they did not address the left-handed relief spot. But they got a reliever, they improved the offense at the edges, and I think that's kind of the best summary.
I agree. It's a little surprising. I think that, whatever argument the Mets want to make internally, right, is the fact that you have, obviously Joely was acquired before the season started as a lefty. It has not worked out. David Peterson has been good as a starter. David Peterson has not been able to figure out how to transition to reliever. So if that's the argument they want to make, that's a gamble. Joe, I know we talked off air how Givens is a guy that can obviously come in and get lefties out, but you still want that matchups player. So I agree with you, right? I'm not one of those doom and gloom at this trade deadline that they didn't get Contreras, that they didn't get JD Martinez. But I think on their mandatory checklist was a lefty reliever. They did not get that done, and they absolutely deserve criticism for that. But the moves they did get into, and that's the most important thing we could do and discuss on today's show, the impact they can make. Let's start with the biggest move they made on actual deadline day, and that is getting Darin Ruf, a veteran player, 36 years old, a guy that can hit for power, a guy that could drive in runs. Similar to Vogelbach, that he does not really play in the field, should not be expected to play in the field, but has a very specific skill, Joe. Vogelbach hits righties, Ruf mashes lefties. Both guys hover around a 900 OPS this year in their specific skills. So Ruf, while that's not the splashiest move, yes, they had to send back J.D. Davis and Sapucky to a lesser extent, but the two A-ball pitchers as well. But this is undoubtedly, Joe, a huge upgrade with a team that's going to play the matchups from J.D. Davis to Darin Ruf, just like Vogelback was from Dom Smith.
Yes, it's definitely a big upgrade from J.D. Davis, and like you mentioned, so if you put together Ruf and Vogelbach and make the platoon here, obviously Darin Ruf with an 886 OPS versus left-handed pitchers this year, and Vogelbach with a 916 OPS versus righties. So ultimately, you're now looking at a team that had bottom of the barrel designated hitter production. It's two guys doing it, but combined, that's big time designated hitter production. So that was a good thing. The return did give me some pause. I mean, Darin Ruf, we know what he brings to the table. He's gonna rake against left-handed pitching. There's no question about that. We know that's gonna happen. But at his age, he's 36. He does have contractual control, so the Mets will have him under control for 2023 and a club option for 2024 if you feel like having 38-year-old Darin Ruf in a couple years. J.D. Davis going makes sense. He feels like a guy that needed a change of scenery. What I found interesting with Thomas Sapucky was the Mets just moved him to the bullpen in AAA Syracuse, and he had 2 outings where he looked great. I mean, his fastball was up to 97. He's got a curveball. And given the fact that they didn't add a lefty reliever, it felt a little peculiar to me that Sapucky ended up included in this trade. And then just to briefly touch on the prospects that were traded, 6th-rounder Carson Seymour. He was a 6th-round pick last year, righty Carson Seymour. Good fastball, gets up to the mid-90s, pretty good breaking ball, putting up solid stats down in Brooklyn. Controls a bit of an issue there, but certainly a talented arm. And this is the one that kind of annoyed me a little bit. I mean, ultimately, we'll see what he becomes. He was a 17th rounder last year, and that's lefty Nick Zwack, who felt like a bit of a player development success story in the early going. He had an ERA under 1 in Brooklyn. His fastball velocity in college was like low 90s. He touched 92, 93. He was touching 96 with Brooklyn. And he was trending towards, likely being the Mets organizational pitcher of the year. So not a massive return, certainly not any of the top prospects, but a quantity of pieces given up to get kind of a part-time player made me raise my eyebrows a little bit on the value.
I'm with you, Joe. I think that you can sit here and say two things, right? It doesn't have to be one end of the scale or the other. The fact is, Ruf is the bat they needed against lefties. J.D. Davis you can do the sample size, right, of what J.D. Davis has been for 3 years. The problem is this year against lefties, J.D. is not hitting, and he's not hitting fastballs. It's concerning. And the Giants can award him the time, maybe, to figure it out and bounce back. The Mets can't. The Mets needed a guy that can hit lefties today, in August, in September, and when they're playing October games. Darin Ruf can do that and has done that in that exact scenario. So that's what they got. On the other end of the scale, you can absolutely point out that J.D. Davis, whatever, Sapucky would have been interesting to see how the lefty reliever project would go with him. But the A-ball flyers, especially Zwack, who you said, that are developmental guys that are showing promise, it felt like a little bit rich of a return. I'll throw this to you, Joe. Do you think the fact that Ruf is under team control for 2023 for a very small $3 million, do you think that played into it where the Giants were like, we don't need to trade this guy. He's technically really not a rental. He can be, in a very specific role, an absolute player in 2023. Despite aging, he still hits lefties. So do you think that came into play here? And I'm not trying to defend the Mets overpaying for Ruf, who I like single-handedly in a vacuum as an addition. But do you think that played into this trade being a little bit lopsided in terms of not matching up with the rest of the market?
It always does. Contractual control tends to reign supreme when it comes to trades. Like, you see rentals, like we're going to talk about Mychal Givens in a minute. That return was light. Like, that's kind of an average return for a rental. So the contractual control definitely had a factor, especially when you look at a team like the Giants, who they're going to be trying to contend in 2023. This isn't a rebuild project. This year didn't quite work. We're going to be back next year. And the last thing on Ruff before we move on, you mentioned the last 3 seasons with J.D. Davis. That brings me to the last 3 seasons for Darin Ruf. He has a 937 OPS against left-handed pitching over the last 3 years. That's 14th among players with at least 150 plate appearances against lefties in that time, just behind Ronald Acuna Jr.
That's insane.
And ahead of the likes of Wander Franco, Salvador Perez, and Jose Abreu. So this is a guy that hits lefties, and the Mets got him and Vogelback, and they're for very specific roles, and they're going to fill them.
Yeah, they're guys that get on base and hit for pop against their specific matchups. So once again, in a vacuum, when you look at Ruff's addition, what he's going to do for the team now completely makes sense. It'll be curious to see how that does carry over into the future, but obviously we're focused on what he can do in these next 3 months. Let's talk about the bullpen, Joe. Interesting situation for the bullpen right now that Trevor May's on the way back, and that can be a big add for this bullpen. Ottavino has been tremendous this year in terms of expectations and contract compared to what he's given them. Seth Lugo, unfortunately, been a bit of a roller coaster. Edwin Diaz, arguably the most unhittable man throwing a baseball in the major leagues right now. But Joe, you know the deal. That's not enough. So you go out, you get Mychal Givens, who was having a tremendous year for the Cubs. As you told me off air, a righty that can get out guys from both sides of the plate. Not really a matchup-specific player necessarily. What did you think overall of this trade, and what do you think Givens gives or slots into the Mets bullpen right away?
Givens gives. I love it. Ultimately, I think he
kind hosting today, folks. Yeah. Trade deadline recap.
I think he slots in kind of right around the Lugo, Ottavino, kind of on the back end, and with Trevor May, I think they could play that from a matchup standpoint. He's a slider heavy pitcher. He does get both hand guys out. Lefties are only hitting 222 against him this year, so he's able to, he's not a guy with the splits there. Obviously, that doesn't make up for the fact that they didn't get a lefty. If in a September game against the Braves in the 7th inning with 2 outs and 2 guys on, and Matt Olson's walking up, it's not like I'm bringing in Mychal Givens to go ahead and get that out. But ultimately, it's a guy with an ERA below 3. He's been very productive. He's played for Buck before, so Buck is familiar with him. I'm sure they asked his thoughts, and he got the thumbs up from Showalter on Givens here. And the return is modest. I mean, Saul Gonzalez, he was a 23rd round pick in the 2018 draft. He spent some time injured. He had Tommy John surgery already. He's pitching okay for St. Lucie this year. I think his ERA is below 3. He's striking out about a guy per inning. But that's kind of a typical rental cost. Like, he's not a guy that would have sniffed my top 20 or 30 prospects, but, just kind of an interesting low minor's arm. And Givens gives the Mets another option in the late innings, and ultimately that's what they're looking for, is options.
Givens gives. And yeah. One more thing with Givens, a little bit of a resurgence. He's been pretty consistent overall throughout his career, but last year, the one thing that jumps out to me, Joe, is that he was striking out 9.5 batters over 9 innings, which is fine, right? This year, that number is well over 11 right now. So Givens has found something. You talked about him being a slider-heavy kind of pitcher. We have seen Hefner do a really good job with not just the staff, but obviously the bullpen as well. So the Mets have seen something, or him unlock something with Chicago this year, and maybe they can continue that throughout the stretch run. So let's revisit this, though, while we're on the bullpen. No lefty acquired. Does this tell you that the Mets have an internal belief in Joely Rodriguez, which, I'm going to be honest, Joe, I find that hard to believe. I've seen GMs stick by their moves to a fault way too many times, whether it's my work covering the NFL or work covering baseball. I'm not convinced that Billy Epler is going to die on the hill of the Miguel Castro for Joely Rodriguez trade. Or do you feel like the Mets just think that whether they think Peterson can convert to a reliever? I know McGill's coming back, and he's not that guy, but obviously they're expecting a bullpen role for him down the stretch run. What is the explanation for this? Because I just find it hard to believe, with all the left-handed relievers on the market, that the Mets had no even fallback option when the clock struck 5:59 p.m. Eastern time on deadline day.
I wonder what the costs for lefty relievers were, because I mean, I may be forgetting trades that happened, but to my knowledge, the only lefty relievers that were moved, Josh Hader and Will Smith. I think that's it. I don't think there was another lefty reliever moved.
No Chafin.
No Chafin. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think so. So I found that a little weird. Maybe it is as simple as he held firm on what he was willing to give up, and the price for an Andrew Chafin or the price for a Gregory Soto was higher than they want to pay. And, I'm a little weirded out about the David Peterson side of things, because it felt like they gave him an audition, and it's like if you give someone an audition and they have a monologue they have to read, and like he forgot half the words. Like he did not succeed in said audition. So I can't imagine they're truly looking at Joely Rodriguez and being like, we're fine. I find that also very hard to believe. So to me, this just feels like a miss. And sometimes you just have to chalk it up to that. I think they missed. They needed a lefty reliever. They didn't get one. I imagine you will see David Peterson get another shot by proxy of what other choice do they have?
I think that's it as well. I think the bottom line is they don't have a guy unless they just really ride out the wave with Joely, who has undoubtedly struggled. And when you look at what he's done, even if you go, overall against the matchups, he just hasn't been what they were hoping for because he simply allows too many guys to get on base. That's the issue with Joely right now, Joe. So it's going to be something that, as much as there are a lot of positives from this deadline, the Mets. And going back to something you said, it is not fair to judge the Mets on what they did in the final 24 hours. Vogelbach gets included in this. Naquin, who I think is going to be a piece, gets included in this. Obviously, Ruf and Givens. They really went through the checklist of a lot of things they needed. And we're going to get down the road and talk catcher at some point on this show, because that was an area they did not upgrade. And we know what everybody listening is probably rallying for right now. We are going to get there, I promise. But the left-handed reliever seemed like the most obvious thing that they did not do, and I'm fascinated to see what their solution is internally. All right, reminder, you're listening to the Mets Pod. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts. You can watch on SNY's YouTube. You can download us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Joe, broad question here as we recap the moves that we went over. Stretch run, we know it's ahead. Big matchups with the Braves. Obviously, the Mets internally, besides the external moves they made, getting healthy, specifically with the arms on this team, the high-powered arms on this team getting healthy. Was this enough? Do you think this was enough, Joe, where I'm not talking about just win the division, which is all of our hopes for the Mets right now. Is this enough when they get into the postseason that they can match up with the teams like the Padres that got Soto, the powerhouse Dodgers? They run into the Braves. Did they do enough at this deadline, or were you left walking away like, man, I don't feel as good as I would have hoped?
More the latter, but we've harped on the lefty reliever. That's honestly the only place where I think they truly missed is getting.
So if they did that, reliever. you wouldn't have thought about this. You'd have been like, yeah,
right.
Enough.
I've been like, they're good. They needed two relievers. That's what they needed. They got one, but the one that they needed even more so was the lefty reliever. Like, that to me was priority numero uno, and they didn't do it. So, do I feel they did enough? No, because they whiffed on something. But with that said, let's not have that cloud our judgment. And I understand frustration right as you see other teams making moves. The reality is the Mets are 65-37 as of this recording. They have Jacob deGrom getting back on the mound tonight. They have Max Scherzer. And if they have those two guys, I don't care what anybody else did. The Mets are still World Series contenders. Maybe they're not World Series favorites or whatever, but we all know how the playoffs work. The playoffs are a semblance of a crapshoot. In 2015, the Mets acquired Yoenis Cespedes. He put the Mets on his back for 2 months and brought them to the playoffs. He got to the playoffs. Cespedes kind of fell off a little bit, and Daniel Murphy put the team on the back. So on the offensive side of the ball, I think they're going to be okay. The rotation, It's going to come and go. Their success, I think, relies heavily on Jake and Max being here, being healthy, and being themselves. If that's the case, I'm putting that rotation. Then you put Bassett behind them or Walker, putting that rotation up against anybody. You face the Padres in a short series. I mean, they're throwing Yu Darvish and Joe Musgrove against Jacob deGrom and Max Scherzer, which obviously those are both good pitchers. I'll take the Mets pitchers over those guys. So I think they're still a big time contender. That lefty reliever would have helped a lot. And I think as we kind of separate from the deadline here over the next week and everyone kind of gets settled back in, I think people are going to realize that this is still a very, very good Mets team. I would argue the best Mets team of my life, like just purely from like a talent standpoint. 2006 or 2022 for me. That's really it. I mean, I was born in 88, so 86 means nothing to me in the sense of I wasn't alive. So they didn't quite do enough to, excite me, but the Mets are still every bit of a contender as anyone else in the National League for sure.
I'm with you, Joe. Not to, shoo away some of the shortcomings of the deadline or the shortcomings right now of this roster, but we cannot lose sight of the fact this is an incredibly talented Mets team that is delivering on that talent despite a lot of key blows throughout the year. Obviously, no DeGrom in the first half. Max Scherzer down for a long time. Losing Tylor Megill, who looked like one of the best young pitchers in the game at the time. Yeah. He looked like he was that guy on the rise that was going to be a household name. So I'm completely with you that just because they didn't make the splash move that would get us excited, that, last year after they make the move for Javi Baez, which they paid a big price, and they learned from that. They didn't want to do that this year. We see Pete Crow Armstrong in top 30 prospect list and some lists in baseball right now. We love seeing Javi Baez in a uniform because it's that, injection of new energy and all this. This Mets team did a lot of the legwork in the winter. They got Starling Marte, who's been a star with the team. Mark Canha's been really good. Max Scherzer has been Max Scherzer. Escobar hasn't lived up to the billing, but he's had a better second half. Francisco Lindor has been drastically better in year number 2 as a New York Met. Pete Alonso is one of the best young sluggers in the game right now. This is a good baseball team. This is a first-place baseball team, and they did, despite it not being a drastic improvement, did get better throughout the week of the deadline. They drastically upgraded from both sides of the plate at DH. Naquin can play all 3 outfield spots. So overall, I'm with you. It's not a question where you could, confidently say they did enough where they're going to be in the World Series. I don't think that would be fair. But barring health, I'm with you that I'd put Jacob deGrom and Max Scherzer up against anybody in the postseason right now and think this lineup can do enough to deliver.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And, like you said about Tylor Megill, they lost him twice. So, so he was IL, came back, went back on the IL. No Trevor May, who's coming back. And, I think, is he, an impact reliever per se? I don't know. But Trevor May has a history of being a very, very good setup man in this league. And when you're talking about the lineup too, you didn't even mention Brandon Nimmo or Jeff McNeil. And Jeff McNeil was an all-star. Brandon Nimmo probably arguably could have been an all-star. So, I'm not trying to blow smoke here or, give false ideas.
It's a great team.
It's a great team that could have done a little more, and it's going to be on the health of Jacob deGrom and Max Scherzer. That's going to determine how far they go when they make the playoffs. And it's a when. It's not an if. It's not a, to me, it's, it's not a situation where they're competing for a spot and, they needed to bulk up big at the deadline in order to make a playoff run. They're going to be in the playoffs. So now they just need to maintain some health and consistency. That's really it.
All right, let's look around the league, obviously, to get a better idea of what the Mets will be up against. But no doubt, a complete shakeup in the NL East. Juan Soto out of the division, and teammate Josh Bell going with him. This was a huge move for the Padres. To recap the full deal for those that did not see the prospects going back that way, and Joe, obviously, you know a lot about farm systems here. Mackenzie Gore and C.J. Abrams, who have both already played in the major leagues, they were in this deal. They were big-time pieces going back. Prospects, Robert Hassel, James Wood. I want to make sure I'm saying this name right. Yarlin Susanna or Jarlin? I'm assuming it's Yarlin. And then Luke Voigt is in this deal as well, which, tough break for Luke Voigt going from a team that could be surging into September, October to the Nationals that are going to be on the rebuild mend for a long time. Staying away from the division, because right now I would not call the Nationals a factor. Joe, what was your reaction to this? Because it's easy for a lot of people, and it's Juan Soto. So you're never going to win when you're trading Juan Soto. And Josh Bell, who's a really good player in his own right. But it's also easy for people that don't know anything about these farm systems or these young players to say, God, what are they doing? What was your overall reaction to Soto going to the Padres, and not only what kind of contender that makes them now, but the package they had to send to land him?
I mean, it obviously makes a massive impact. Juan Soto is one of the very best players in baseball, and he's only 23. And he's 23. Like John Morosi told us on the show, he was younger than 12 players that participated in the Futures game, which is about the future of the sport. So that just kind of exacerbates that point. The reality is you're not winning a Juan Soto trade. You just said it. There is no realistic trade value that exists that equates to Juan Soto. So if you take that out of the equation, the reality is the Nationals lost just by proxy of they traded Juan Soto. That's it. But if you just want to assess the talent, I don't know if I've ever seen this much talent traded in a trade ever in my life. At least that, I wasn't covering prospects when I was little, but certainly since I've been covering, I've never seen anything like this. I mean, CJ Abrams and Mackenzie Gore up at the top are current major league players that just graduated off prospect lists. They both were top 5, top 10 prospects in all of baseball. Robert Hassel's a guy I'm very high on. I think MLB Pipeline had him at number 21 or 22 in all of baseball. To me, he's more top 15.
Okay.
James Wood is a guy that he was a second-round pick last year, and he's had a massive first year. The Padres helped out his swing a bit when he was coming out of the IMG Academy, and there's some scouts that think James Wood is just as good a prospect as Robert Hassel is, just he doesn't have the same level of experience. And then Harlan, I don't want to be disrespectful, I'm not sure how to say his first name, but Susana was the top international pitching prospect in the 2021 international class. He signed for about $2 million with the Padres, and he touches 102, big time changeup, breaking ball. So when you just assess this package as a whole, it is not worth Juan Soto. These are prospects. We don't know what they're ultimately going to become, and we know what Juan Soto is. But this is a incredible haul of talent. So the Padres win, but that can't also mean that also can mean that the Nationals got a lot of talent back.
Yeah, they did. And, some of that talent is going to be in the big leagues very shortly. Some of it we've seen in the big leagues. You would imagine they are going to go right into that major league clubhouse for the Nationals, and they're accepting that they're going to deal with the growing pains over at least the next 2 to 3 years. That's what kind of rebuild this is, Joe. So a major splash. We know the Padres are winners. They got Juan Soto. They have a dream of a lineup of him, Machado, obviously Josh Bell, and then the dream is that Tatis goes on a rehab assignment soon and is back for the stretch run. But getting away from the Padres, because that's the obvious, who are some of your winners and losers of the deadline? Because for me, I thought the Yankees made a good volume of moves that they needed to make. I thought the Phillies were very aggressive, not a team that I still look at and fear in the National League when you stack them up against the Mets, Braves, Dodgers, Padres, but they absolutely put their foot on the gas and are trying to get a wild card spot. And I didn't really come away thinking, man, there was a lot of losers at this deadline that needed to do more. Maybe the Guardians or the Rays, but we know how those small market clubs often operate in terms of being a little bit more reserved.
I like what the Astros did a lot. They got Trey Mancini and Christian Vasquez. So they already have a really... Oh, and Will Smith. I forgot the reliever, Will Smith.
Yeah, they were very active.
Yeah, so they were active. They made some moves. They got help for a lineup that probably didn't sorely need it. So they just add to a strength. They were deep in the rotation to the point where someone was going to end up getting kicked out of it when Lance McCullers comes back off the IL here in the next week or two. So they were able to flip Odorizzi, who, he's fine, back-end type of guy, and they spun him for a reliever that could pitch, late in games, probably right behind Presley, their closer. So I thought the Astros did really well. I'm very interested to see what the Red Sox were thinking.
It felt like 1 foot in and 1 foot out.
Yeah. It was definitely interesting to me. I don't even know if I want to classify them as a winner or a loser, but they sold Vasquez as a rental. So to me, that was like, okay, they're going to sell JD Martinez and Nathan Eovaldi and these other rentals. They didn't sell any other ones, and they acquired 3 guys in Eric Hosmer, Tommy Pham, and Reese McGuire, who could be on the team in 2023. So it's kind of the old they bought and sold at the same time. So, I mean, that's a Chaim Bloom thing. That's a Tampa Bay Ray model thing, or Tampa Bay Ray with money model thing. The Phillies obviously were a team that did well. So, yeah, there was definitely more winners than losers, I would say. Like, the biggest loser is just the Washington Nationals because they traded Juan Soto.
Yeah, I think for me it's the Nationals, and as well as the Reds did with the Castillo trade, right? The Reds are unfortunately staring at a long rebuild where they have really gutted every ounce of talent. They got rid of Naquin, Drury, Malley, Castillo. It's a tough road, an uphill climb for both those teams. All right, let's get into the mailbag because we got a couple of really good questions today that if you notice, we've been avoiding some topics because of how good these questions were, and we knew we'd save it for the latter half of the show. Joe, this first one's from Junior. He said, do you think the Mets call up Francisco Alvarez after not getting a catcher? Now, while we've been doing this show, Billy Epler has said that that's not in the immediate plans, but when you look at it, Epler also did not rule it out for the entire season. He said there's a couple of things that Alvarez needs to work on offensively and defensively. So when you look at this, Joe, are you open to the idea that maybe in a couple of weeks we do see Alvarez, especially with the fact McCann and Nido have given the Mets basically zero offense in the lineup all season?
I don't know how they can do it before September 1st when rosters expand by 2 spots. Because, I mean, if you look up and down the Mets roster right now, I mean, you're not going to want to be short in the bullpen to carry a third catcher. And there's not a player on their roster other than Kramer Robertson, who's here for a day. He'll be, sent back to AAA tomorrow when Ruf arrives. But there's no one to send down. There's almost no one with minor league options. I think Luis Guillorme has minor league options, but you're not sending Luis Guillorme to AAA. So to me, it's one of those things that unless their plan is to cut James McCann and eat his money,
no shot.
Or cut Tomas Nido because he's out of minor league options, that's another no shot. Like, it doesn't make sense. Right? It just doesn't make sense right now from a roster standpoint. But if Alvarez continues, he's been better in AAA. He's really been hitting. He's been.
What are you noticing with Alvarez? Because the home runs are starting to arrive in Syracuse.
He's being more selective. So when he first got there, he was striking out, it felt like 3 times a game. He was just chasing everything. And when you get to the real upper levels, like AA's upper minors, but AAA is, just a step below the big leagues, they're not going to give you pitches to hit until you force them to. And he's forcing them to. So things are starting to look better there. So you can tell me on September 1st that the rosters expand by 2 and you want to add Alvarez and give him a shot. And, if he hits in September, I'm pretty sure the rule is now that, like, if you get called up on September 1st, you're still eligible for the postseason. I know the rule used to be that you had to be up before that. So if he comes up and he rakes, then you don't have to have James McCann or Tomas Nido on the playoff roster when that time comes. So that's kind of where I stand on Alvarez.
So that sounds like to me, Joe, that if Alvarez can come up, and you're right, that's the date to mark down, is when they expand. So we're thinking about a month from now. That is a situation that he would probably be taking Nido's roster spot for the playoffs if he came up and had some lightning in a bottle where he's feeding off, he's got adrenaline or the pro crowd, he's got more pop off the bench. But the problem is, Joe, we know that defensively that would put a lot on McCann's shoulders for the postseason because you're not going to ride Alvarez that hard defensively, something they've been very comfortable doing with Nido. So that's my takeaway, and one that we're going to be monitoring really, really closely. All right, let's get into more mailbag questions. This one from John Hidalgo says, come October, who are the top 3 relievers and the 8th inning guy before Diaz? Looks like Ottavino, Lugo, and Givens, .. maybe McGill. What do you think of that, Joe?
So I think Trevor May needs to be a part of this discussion as well. I think May, Ottavino, and Givens probably, to me, are probably the top three. I think Lugo and Givens are close enough. I mean, Lugo had, obviously we know he's been a roller coaster. We've talked about that. But the last few outings, he's kind of looked right. That doesn't mean tonight or tomorrow we won't see 93-mile-an-hour Seth Lugo that you can't trust.
Curveball looks better, though.
Yeah, curveball looks better. The RPMs are there. So I don't know. Lugo's kind of up and down. But I think you're definitely leaning on May, Givens, and Ottavino. Because like you said, and it's not even with Ottavino, it's not just the contract. Like, the contract's a bonus that they've gotten the value on the contract. He's just been fantastic. There's just no other way to put it. He's been great. And I think Tyler McGill, when he comes into the bullpen, I assume they won't thrust him into the big spots right away. But he has a stuff that if you have him in 1-2 inning spurts, you might see, as long as he's healthy, that upper 90s with the breaking ball and the improved changeup, he has a chance to be impactful too. So I don't think the bullpen is a problem per se. We know what they could have added more. But the back end, I think those are really the names to think about.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to throw at you. Doesn't it seem like McGill has, I never want to say a seamless transition, because we've seen guys that look very comfortable as starters just not really figure it out. Coming out of the bullpen, it's October, it's cold, it's a different environment, it's a different scenario coming into the middle of a game or the end of a game. But McGill, all 6'7", big drip, 230 pounds of him, 240, with that power fastball we saw this year have a new life of its own. It almost seems like he's a guy that if you're betting on somebody to transition to the pen, he would be the guy that you kind of have high hopes for to give you maybe the 6th and 7th inning in a few games.
I agree. No, I definitely agree. And I mean, if you go back to when he was in college, he wasn't a starter until his last year at Arizona. So he was a reliever then. Even shortly before he was called up, I talked to people with the Mets that are like, this guy has a chance to be a good reliever at the next level. And he got the opportunity to start, and he was great there. But now the question is, he's had a couple injury things. So is the arm built to be a starter? Or was it he was a really good starter for a short period of time, the arm is not going to withstand the rigors of being a starter, and he's a long-term reliever? I think that's obviously a possible outcome. But with the stuff, like you said, the stuff and his demeanor, it's, it's
even
ice,
keeled.
Right? Yeah, he's even keeled. By all accounts, like, if you had to do a checklist of things in order to translate to being a reliever, I think Tyler McGill checks essentially every box. And you just have to see how it works out when that time comes.
All right, last mailbag question. Aurelio Morales asked, do you think that by only adding Ruf from the right side of the plate that the Mets will call up Vientos, or are those two different subjects? So, Joe, my thought was by adding Ruf, it actually stops the Mets right now. We know September can change that, but right now, from calling up Vientos, because it seems like Vientos, who we know, has killed left-handed pitching in the minor league level. He hits from power to all areas of the outfield. This, to me, felt like the move that might keep Vientos off the team in the short term.
Yeah, totally agree. I think at this point, you're not going to, barring injury or something like that, it's probably unlikely you see Vientos anytime soon. The one thing that does kind of raise my eyebrows a bit is, we were talking about JD Martinez. We were talking about bigger names for DH, and even
CJ
the possibility
Cron.
Cron, like even the possibility of pushing Vogelback to being a primary bench power bat. The fact that they went and got just a platoon guy with him, it makes you wonder, why wasn't Mark Vientos called up in early to mid-July, which we've talked about that on this show.
Yeah.
I can't understand why it didn't happen, but it didn't. Certainly, I think it adds a kink to what's the future look like, because Vogelback is under control for next year. Darin Ruf is under control for next year. What is Mark Vientos' role on the 2023 Mets? Forget the 2022 Mets.
That's a great call.
It's obviously a question for a few months from now, because the Mets are in the midst of a pennant race here. Certainly, though, the addition of Darin Ruf, I think, barring injury, has kind of ended the chances of Mark Vientos making an impact at the big league level, anytime soon.
I find that interesting, Joe. We heard so much buzz before the deadline that the Mets were pretty adamant about not trading Vientos, about him not being in a package, especially for a rental. But once again, I can't explain this enough. Vogelbach and Ruf, for what they are technically not rentals. They are guys that could be in a platoon as the DH of this team next year. Now, the Mets are always going to explore upgrades, but if those guys are producing, they are going to go into spring training with that shot or with that job, since somebody have to take it from them. Do you find it interesting, Joe, that they refuse to trade Vientos, which is fine with me? I mean, you've watched this guy's development for a long time. A guy that was drafted out of high school, that's developed every way you could ask for. He's got some of the best power in the system. That he seems like a man without a position that mashes lefties, where it's pretty obvious what his role is, but now they have some veterans that could be blocking him. Is that, to me, it's just an interesting scenario how much they valued him.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and I'd love to, like, I think I have to think about it, because it's definitely a weird scenario of, like you said, he doesn't really have much of a position. The Mets have largely taken him off third base. The outfield experiment did not work. So he's kind of a first baseman DH at this point, and, Darin Ruf's under control for next year. I think next year is a guaranteed. I think the options for 2024
That's
for
right.
like $3 million. Vogelbach has $1 million option for next year. So hypothetically, that's your DH duo next year for $4 million. I wonder if the Mets looked at this as, we need to hang on to these prospects at the deadline. And obviously, I think they have big picture visions of improving the farm system. And me as a prospect guy, I'm really excited that I put out a top 10 list, like, right after the draft, and I don't have to change it. Like, we're good. Everything's stuck as is, so we're fine there. But I wonder if it's an idea of saving these chips. Maybe a guy like Vientos can be a part of an off-season deal. I'm not going to say Shohei Ohtani, but I'm not going to not say Shohei Ohtani. Like, who knows? Like, they're going to have the chips where they're going to be able to make impactful moves come the offseason. And Vientos' fit made sense like 7 hours ago, or a few hours ago. Mark Vientos' fit for the 2023 team seemed clear as day. Like, it felt like they have Vogelbach. They'll probably get some rental to split time with him. And then next year, you just go, boom, Vientos and Vogelbach for under $2 million as your DH. Darin Ruf's under contract. So, I mean, hypothetically, they can move Ruf or whatever, but there's a possibility that maybe Vientos, there wasn't a fit to trade him at the deadline, but there could be come the offseason.
It's a great point, and obviously that's going to be a theme of our show when the season does end. The Mets, as we've said many times, Jacob deGrom has been very vocal about opting out. We know Taijuan Walker is a guy that could very well get to the market if he decides to do that. Chris Bassett can do that. We think the Mets will keep Carlos Carrasco around on his team option, but the Mets are going to have some holes in the rotation, and we've seen already this front office aggressively address those on the trade and veteran market. So you're all over it as well. It's a question of, do you want to trade Vientos for a player that can help half of a season or really almost a third of a season, or do you want to maybe keep him, see what you have in him, and trade him for a player that can be a long-term part of the equation, which is always the wiser move. All right, Joe, stretch run. It's August. The Mets have huge games coming up, especially when we do a show next week. They'll be coming off a long stretch against the Braves where the division, we're going to have a pretty good picture painted of where the division stands for the pennant race. Closing thoughts on today's episode of the Mets Pod.
I understand a lot of fans are disappointed. I see you on Twitter. I see you in my mentions. I understand. Take a step back. Take a breath, realize that you're watching a fantastic baseball team, and let's just enjoy these next 2-3 months of baseball, because the Mets are going to be not, competitive games in September or whatever it is. Like, they're a real contender. So let's just enjoy the run, and, Darin Ruf and Daniel Vogelbach will hit some dingers for you, and that should make you feel good.
All right, you heard the man. All right, reminder, everybody, subscribe to the Mets Pod. You can listen on Apple Podcasts. You can watch on SNY's YouTube. You can listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.